Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 24th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs are meant to illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism through time, and stories of resistance against injustice. Today, we will be discussing David de Jong's new book, Nazi Billionaires, which was published just last month. We're honored to be joined by David and Gregory Zuckerman. David is a correspondent in the Middle East, where he writes for the Dutch Financial Daily. For the research and writing of Nazi Billionaires, he reported from Berlin for 4 years. Before that, he was a reporter at Bloomberg News in New York, where he wrote about hidden wealth and billionaire fortunes, and in Amsterdam, where he wrote about European banking and finance. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Bloomberg Business Week. He was born and raised in Amsterdam and currently lives in Tel Aviv. Nazi Billionaires is David's first book. Gregory is a special writer at the Wall Street Journal, where he has written for 20 years. He is the author of several books, including The Greatest Trade Ever, the behind-the-scenes story of how John Paulson defied Wall Street and made financial history, The Man Who Solved the Market, how Jim Simons launched the quant revolution, and most recently, A Shot to Save the World, the inside story of the life or death race for a COVID-19 vaccine. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can during the hour. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and I'm now going to hand things over to Gregory and David.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm assuming everybody can hear us. And so yes, Sydney, thank you for the introduction and for hosting. It's a real honor to be here with David and with everyone. It's a appropriate time. Today is Yom Ha'atzmaut. Yesterday, Yom HaZikaron, and last week, Yom HaShoah. So these are appropriate themes and relevant themes to us all. And I'm thrilled to welcome David. Those who haven't read the book yet really should. It's eye-opening in a lot of ways. It's interesting, it's fascinating. I was gonna say enjoyable, but I don't know if, it's inappropriate to say enjoyable about a book with these kind of themes, but it is enjoyable in that it teaches, and it is also well written. So I encourage everybody to pick up a copy. I'm gonna toss some questions at David this afternoon, but we're also gonna allow some opportunity for the audience. We have a nice group of people with us this afternoon, so feel free. I think in the Q&A there's a room there, and if I can manage it, I'll keep an eye out for the Q&A for questions, and we'll leave some time at the end. So thank you again, David. And first I want to talk about the writing process. Yours was a challenging book in a lot of ways. Maybe start off with what the biggest challenge was, and we'll go from there.
Well, the biggest challenge, well, thanks, Greg, first of all. The biggest challenge certainly was that I'm a native Dutch speaker and writer, and I wrote a book in English based on German sources on a topic that's, in Germany particularly, very sensitive and extremely secretive. So it took me 4 years. I mean, I got the idea 8 years ago, but it took me 4 years of researching and writing from Berlin to put everything together. And of course, and this is something you've come across in your reporting as well, bar one heir, none of the families I write about in the book or around me, I'm talking about family officers, lawyers, close acquaintances, even nobody wanted to talk to me. So I had to report around it.
I was going to ask about that. Were there not individual members of these families that felt the need to discuss these important issues? Did you not find any of them? Was it uniform like that?
No, I found one heir, the grandson of Friedrich Flick, Gerd Rudolf Flick, or better known as Muck Flick, quite a well-known in the sense that he there was a scandal in the 1990s where he tried to endow a chair at Oxford, at Balliol College, in the Flick name, and it became a huge uproar in the UK, particularly in Jewish circles, of course, because his grandfather, Friedrich Flick, was arguably Germany's most notorious industrialist from the 20th century, and was convicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity at Nuremberg. And his Muck tried to endow the chair not in his grandfather's name, but in the name of Flick, just in the general Flick name. And he ended up pulling the funding from the chair. I corresponded with him. I was allowed to cite part of our correspondence. I cited in the notes on sources, but except for him, his brother, his sister never responded to any interview requests I sent to their family offices and their foundations, and that goes for all other of the individual heirs whose patriarchs and were right about themselves. Some of their family office spokespeople answered my question. Some of their company spokespeople, like BMW, gave me a statement. Porsche, actually, the Porsche spokesperson was probably the most engaged. We went into this ping pong kind of for 10 months, this correspondence where, back and forth. He tried to duck and dodge my questions, and I tried to drill down as best as I could. It's interesting because Porsche really tried to protect the myth of Porsche, and to really try to protect the brand and at all costs, more so than the other companies did.
It's fascinating because Germany as a nation has taken a large degree of responsibility. There's accountability, reparations. One can say maybe they should have done more, but I think one has to give a lot of credit. And that's a real contrast with these families. Care to explore that a little bit? And is that something that came as a surprise, perhaps?
It is. I mean, these families are very much out of step with Germany's remembrance culture, and I think it is. I mean, there's a couple of theories I have about it. First of all, these heirs, they completely derive their identity from being heirs. I mean, it's their fathers and grandfathers who created the fortune, who made the last name big, in a way. And I very much think that for them, disavowing or being completely transparent about their father's, crimes, is like disavowing their own identity and what is left of them, except for their money. If they also, because they're completely in the shadows of their fathers and grandfathers, if they also kind of disavow, by being transparent, they're disavowing their patriarchs. So that's one part of it, what I think. Secondly, they have major business interests. BMW, Porsche. Well, actually, it's a Volkswagen Group which is listed, and they're spinning off Porsche later this year, and which is going to be shaping up to be one of the biggest IPOs in 2022. These are stock exchange listed companies, and by being fully transparent, I think they worry that it might hurt their sales, their bottom line, their standing, their brands, and I think that they think by only showing the business successes and not the war crimes that they protect the brand.
Yeah. Even though one can argue that transparency about the past, maybe you could help the brand.
Exactly. That's completely what I think too. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Let's go back to the writing process just a little bit. I found it fascinating that the characters are interesting and you want to read about them, and yet there's a line you don't want to cross as an author, I'm sure, but as a reader too, in terms of sympathizing with
Right.
them or
Right.
empathizing. How did you, as a writer, deal with that? And did you think it through? Did you say, I don't want to make this character too appealing, or did that not cross your mind?
No, luckily that didn't cross my mind. Also because I I didn't have to dig that deep into the characters because there's so little of their personal the way they fought personally or any of their personal reflections. It is so they were so business minded that there's very little of their individuals or to be able to draw a character was extremely complicated because they're so secretive. These patriarchs are so shrouded in secrecy, and even going to the archives, you get very little sense of who these men actually were for the most part. So I luckily I didn't have to worry about that simply because of the scantness of sourcing material.
Yeah, but I would argue that just describing the love life
Right.
of Gunther and
Right.
Magna and that love triangle and then Hitler getting involved. I mean,
Yes.
there's
Sure.
that temptation it's humanizing them, and I don't mean this in a critical
Sure.
way. It's a
No.
difficult decision on the part of the author.
No, definitely. In a way, I mean, it's my favorite. It's one of my favorite storylines. This love triangle between Günter Quandt, Magda Goebbels, and Joseph Goebbels, or and the custody fight that they had over Harold Quandt. But in a way, it's oddly out of step with the rest of the book, which is so much about business, but it is, it makes them human. I mean, I don't know. I mean, does it make them more sympathy? I mean, I think they still come off as horrible individuals. You know, both Günter Quandt and Magda and Joseph Goebbels. You know, regardless of describing their love lives. I mean, they were, you know, Günter Quandt was a ruthless opportunist. And Joseph and Magda Goebbels were the most radical family of the Third Reich. So there's no, you know, it's Harold Quandt, who I personally would argue is perhaps the only protagonist of sorts, or somebody who has some sort of likability because of growing up being basically kidnapped by his stepfather and his mother, and growing up in the most radical Nazi family and never becoming a Nazi party member as a teenager, completely being disinterested in Nazism at all, and just wanting to, you know, drive motorcycles, drive fast cars, and chase girls, you know, and flunking out of the Hitler Youth camps, and just and also being quite frank to his stepfather about that the war is being lost when he is on the front lines as a paratrooper. And he, in you know, if I would pick one character that I had some semblance of humanity in him, it's Harold Quandt to me.
Yeah, and just to make clear, I think you did a great job of shedding light on these characters without personalizing him to the point where you empathize. But then again, you know,
Right.
you're helped by the subject matter. The reader remembers it's a story about the Holocaust, so it's hard at the end of the day to empathize too much with these people.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about the key characters in your book, and which you found the most interesting.
I mean, there's 5 families I write about. It's the Quandt dynasty, which is the red thread of the book. Arguably, the 2 of the Quandt heirs today control BMW as they're controlling shareholders of BMW, and their founding patriarch Günter Quandt, who came to be one of Germany's largest arms and batteries producers, one of the largest, you know, of private individuals in industry, exploiters of forced and slave labor, as well as, you know, Aryanizing and expropriating Jewish-owned companies as well as companies in Nazi-occupied territories, and who got off scot-free together with his son Herbert after the war. His son Herbert was an important executive in his companies as well, and is now held up through the BMW Herbert Quandt Foundation as with the perverse motto "Inspire Responsible Leadership" in the name of a Nazi war criminal, and it's a global foundation. This is not just contained to Germany. So that's one family. And then the second one is the Flick family, who we touched on earlier, who Friedrich Flick, as I said earlier, was the most notorious, arguably the most notorious of the industrialists of the 20th century in Germany. Controlled the largest privately held steel, coal, and weapons conglomerate during the Third Reich. Was convicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity at Nuremberg, and his sentence was commuted by J McCloy in 1950, alongside many others. And within a decade, he was back on top as Germany's richest man, as controlling shareholder of Daimler-Benz. The third family, arguably the most secretive and most, well, in many ways, also most insidious today, is the von Fink clan, who the patriarch co-founded Allianz and Munich Re, two of the largest insurers and reinsurers today. They also controlled this private bank called Merck Fink in Munich, which was sold to Barclays a couple of decades ago. And August von Fink Sr. Was tasked by Hitler to fundraise. He was Bavaria's wealthiest and stingiest man, or at least that's how he was described in the Nazi Party. So Hitler tasked him to fundraise in 1933, from 1933 onwards, for the Haus der Deutsche Kunst, which is still today one of Munich's landmark museums. It's on the southern edge of the English Garden. It's a beautiful building. And his fundraising, because he didn't want to spend any money of his own, with fellow tycoons and financiers, he raised 20 million Reichsmark. The building opened in 1937, and as a thank you, he got to Aryanize the Rothschild Bank, the Austrian branch of the Rothschild Bank in Vienna, which at the time was the largest private bank in Austria.
Aryanize. I always thought that word something of a euphemism. Aryanize. Maybe explain just for a second.
Yeah, no, pardon. Sorry, that's a very important, particularly in this conversation, it's a very important. So Aryanize was the removing of Jewish ownership from an asset, whether this was a company, shares, company shares, real estate, art, jewelry, you name it. It became exactly the euphemism that became prevalent in Nazi Germany and larger and after that in Nazi occupied Europe for the expropriation of Jewish business owners, of Jewish men and women, and their belongings. And it had initially had the veneer of a normal business transaction, until from 1935 onwards, from the Nuremberg race laws were instituted, to the outright expropriation of their assets and stealing, just plain robbery, as the 1930s, as the persecution ramps up, and particularly from 1937, 1938 onwards. That is the term is yeah, it's a terrible term, but yeah. So von Fink was then allowed to Aryanize the Rothschild Bank in Austria, as well as the Dreyfus Bank in Berlin, and also got off scot-free after war. Again, became one of was one of the largest landowners in Bavaria. And his son, August von Fink Jr., who passed away in November 2021, late November 2021, at 91, was reported to be one of the became one of Germany's, well, I would say one of Europe's largest and most secretive investors. Never gave one interview to the press. His father at least did, and started funding right-wing and eventually far-right causes from the 1990s onwards, and until as recent as reportedly the last couple of years, where he was suspected to be one of the main backers of the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, the major far-right party, in the major far-right opposition party in Germany, funding its rise. And very little research has been done on the von Finks, who actually his sons, August von Fink Jr.'s sons, sit on the board of Georgetown University. They all went to Georgetown, where you also have the BMW Center for German Studies at Georgetown. Fourthly, there's a Porsche Piech family, who today control the Volkswagen Group. It is arguably the only family in the book. No, it is the only family in the book that laid the foundation for its fortune during the Third Reich. The other families I write about were already extremely wealthy at the point that Hitler seized power. Of course, Ferdinand Porsche designed the Volkswagen and convinced Hitler to put it into production. But a lesser known story is that Porsche, together with his son-in-law, Anton Piech, founded the Porsche car design firm in 1930, together with Adolf Rosenberger, a Jewish man from Pforzheim, Germany, a former race car driver, and also a car designer like Ferdinand Porsche, who was the financial backer and a commercial director of Porsche, and who ended up leaving Porsche, or resigning from Porsche under murky circumstances on January 30th, 1933, the day Hitler seized power in Germany. Stayed on as a shareholder until July 1935, and was then bought out at the nominal value of his shares, so far below the market value of his shares, by Ferdinand Porsche and Anton Piech, and his shares were transferred to Ferry Porsche, Ferdinand Porsche's son. And Adolf Rosenberger was subsequently erased from Porsche company history. Adding insult to injury, Ferry Porsche, who voluntarily applied to the SS in 1938, was admitted to the SS in 1941, designed the first Porsche sports car in 1947, made Porsche into the global sports icon that it is today, surrounded himself with high-ranking SS officers, former SS officers in the 1950s and 60s, many of whom death sentences were commuted, or some of whom sentences, or in one case, death sentence was commuted by a US-German panel, and then immediately got out of prison and were employed by Porsche. But adding insult to injury, in his Porsche's first autobiography, We at Porsche, which was published in 1967 in the US first, where he spewed virulent anti-Semitic vitriol about Adolf Rosenberger, in plain sight. He didn't even have, there was no qualms about that. There seemed to be no, that he thought he could just write that. Where he accuses Rosenberger of extorting Ferry Porsche and his father and brother-in-law after the war for trying to come back, trying to be reinstated as a Porsche shareholder, and then trying to be compensated rightfully as a former Porsche shareholder.
It felt to me like he had some guilty conscience there, where he knew Rosenberg, he owed a lot to Rosenberg, and was lashing out. Besides the traditional anti-Semitism, maybe there was some element of
interesting.
I didn't realize the role that Rosenberg had played.
Right. No, very few people unfortunately have. He was one of the co-founders of Porsche, and a major. I mean, Ferdinand Porsche, would spend prolifically on Porsche designs. He was the one who kept it afloat for the first couple of years.
And Rosenberg was a German hero, wasn't he? A war hero?
Yeah, he was in. Yes, exactly. Yes, you're absolutely right. He served for he fought for the German Empire in World War One, as many German Jewish men did during World War One, right? Yeah, and he ended up being after 6 weeks after he transferred his shares to Ferry Porsche or sold his shares, he was arrested by the Gestapo and was held in a remand prison in Karlsruhe, and then held for a few days in a concentration camp Kislau, and ended up immigrating to the United States, to Los Angeles.
Yeah, thank God he got out at least. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, indeed. Yeah.
So I do have to ask you. I was reading about the Porsche family in a park recently, and then I get in my car, and parked right next to me is a Porsche.
Yeah.
So and many people in my community and others drive Porsches and some of these other products that you write about. What is your own attitude? And frankly, I'll just express to me that it was a reminder for me. You know it, but you don't know it. You forget it. Maybe it's been years. And listen, you go to Israel and you see buses. Every bus is or at least used to be Mercedes-Benz. So
right.
So it's complicated stuff. What's your own perspective?
I mean, I'm a journalist, so I think people should make up their own minds to what consumer brands they buy or own or drive or eat. People should make up their own minds with the facts from the book. But what my argument of the book is historical transparency. And if you are going to maintain a foundation in Ferry Porsche's name or in Herbert Quandts' name, and you just celebrate the fact that Ferry Porsche designed the first Porsche sports car in 1947, but leave out the fact that he was a voluntary SS member or that he affiliated himself with high-ranking SS officers at Porsche while as CEO, that should not be. They should be transparent about their history. They should show that history. Or same with the BMW Herbert Quandt Foundation, with the only line, similar with Ferry Porsche, the only line on the BMW Herbert Quandt Foundation's website is the fact that about Herbert Quandt is the fact that he saved BMW from bankruptcy in 1959. But it doesn't say that Herbert Quandt planned, built, and dismantled a sub-concentration camp in Nazi-occupied Poland in late 1945 early 1945. That he had the responsibility over battery factories in Berlin, where thousands of forced and slave laborers were exploited, including hundreds of female slave laborers from concentration camps. That he acquired companies seized from Jews, battery companies seized from Jews in France, and that he used at his own private estate prisoners of war and forced labor. So, you inspire responsible leadership by being transparent about history, by showing the good and the bad. And, if they don't want to do that, they should not name the foundations after these men.
So I have to ask you, after doing your research, would you drive a Porsche or a BMW?
I would not, no, but I find them also, in Dutch we would say, or in German you would say, proleterig, or like polo. It's nouveau. To me, these cars I find them to be nouveau riche, and I don't like them.
Okay.
Yeah. But that's more of a personal. That's more of a personal aesthetic than yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
So as I read the book, I kept thinking about Hannah Arendt and various quotes from Arendt, and we all have various ones. One I picked out was, hold on one second. The sad truth, and I'm not a huge fan of hers. I don't want to make that clear, but I'm just sharing it.
Okay.
The sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil.
Right.
And
right. It's a good quote.
I kept wondering how much these people knew, how much was their willful ignorance, of what was going on. There clearly was elements of anti-Semitism, obviously, among all the people you write about. But did they know? I mean, how? What level was their knowledge? How do you weigh in on? And again, I saw there were so many accommodations. There were some people like Quandt who helped some Jews as well, right? While also hurting, robbing others.
Yeah.
So
yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he helped Jews that there's an example I name in the book of George Sachs, who was the head of metallurgy for Quandts, for Günter Quandts, for Günter Quandts weapons manufacturer, DWM. And once Sachs gets on the radar of and it is already in 1930, Günter Quandt appoints him to the board, I think in 1936 or 1937 even. And then he gets on the radar of Joseph Goebbels's Berlin district, and Günter Quandt helps him, gives him money to leave for the United States, and he ends up being a professor of metallurgy at Case Western University in Ohio. And I mean, this was somebody, he helped him because this was somebody who was beneficial to his company. I mean, that's how he fought. This was not out of a love for Jews. I mean, yeah, no, they were brazen opportunists. I mean, it's also not like these men were convinced anti-Semites, right? They were not racial anti-Semites. I would say they were latent anti-Semites. They were intrinsic anti-Semites in the sense that it was so normal to anti-Semitism in Germany, and especially in those circles or in the Christian circles, was so intrinsic in a way. Lutheran particularly, many people saw in Hitler the reincarnation of Martin Luther, right? Because Martin Luther was virulently anti-Semitic. So it was not, I mean, they had a lot of Jewish business partners, Günter Quandt helped Jews who were beneficial to his company, to help them get out. Maybe he could use them in the future. Who knows? I mean, that was kind of the thinking. If he saw a good business opportunity, if he saw a company he could buy on the cheap from a Jewish family, then he would had no scruples, no qualms about exploiting that opportunity as well.
So are the people you write about, if you could generalize, or maybe talk specifically if you want, are they amoral? Are they amoral? Are they people that didn't focus on ethics? How would you weigh in? Or are they just bad? Are they bad people?
No, they're bad people, but I would say amorality is also, is also bad. They were amoral. Yeah, they were amoral, and they were also, to an extent, they were also criminals. They committed crimes. It wasn't just, I mean, there's a very clear distinction one has to make between profiting from capitalism, right, and committing crimes. You could put some of the things they did, like rearmament, profiting from rearmament. Hitler initiated this massive rearmament push in 1934, and you had billions flowing to the coffers of these industrialists. That's I would argue, that was against the Versailles Treaty, so the rearmament was initially secretive until Hitler went public with it in 1935. That's profiting from capitalism. Benefiting from the mass forced and slave labor program that was put in place in Germany from 1941 onwards, increasing gradations of brutality, of torture, of murder. That's criminal. Expropriating the assets owned by Jews is a criminal act. And they were also indicted for it, or at least Friedrich Flick was indicted for it after the war, and convicted for at least war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Were there examples that were uplifting, that were encouraging to you? Anybody act in a righteous way that you came across in your research? That's
No.
telling. This pause, yeah.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, I'm racking my brain, and it's funny that no one has ever asked me the question in the past couple of weeks. But no. I mean, they're uplifting in a way where they, well, I mean, I just, sometimes they help people. I guess, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I do. Yeah, yes. Sometimes they help Jews. I guess I came across that example. Yeah.
When it suited them, when
it suited them, yeah, exactly. So yeah, when it benefited them. So that's again, yeah. I mean, I'm trying to rack my brain to say something positive, but unfortunately, I can't. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you don't have to, but
unfortunately, I mean, it is what it is. Yeah, yeah.
Right. How what do you do with the question of how we judge them, and are we in a position to judge them? Meaning that it obviously seems obvious the actions aren't those that they're all condemnable, but who knows how Western capitalists would have acted in those same positions. How do you wrestle with that kind of question?
I think they would have. You mean if, like, saying like British capitalists under? I mean, or
American today, capitalists today.
Like under like, are we saying if Charles Lindbergh would have been the president of the United States and it would have done it? I mean, is that kind of the question? Or I mean,
no, because he was ideological by nature.
Right.
Lindbergh. I'm thinking.
No, but I mean, like, if had Charles Lindbergh become the president of the U.S. and would have instilled the same policies that Hitler did in Germany, how they would have wrestled with that? Like, do you think? Yeah, they would have done the same. They would have done the same. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is not intrinsic to German. This is to Germany. No, this is no. They would have done the same. Yeah, Henry Ford was a virulent anti-Semite, as we know. Would have done the same had Charles Lindbergh become president and instilled the same kind of policies that Adolf Hitler did. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about an alternate reality here, but yeah.
So there's nothing exceptional about these people necessarily, or about Germany itself, in your view?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, in many ways, Nazi Germany was exceptional because it was, and it happened, right? And there is no comparison to what happened, or the acts that Nazi Germany perpetrated. But we should view it on a level. I mean, we're both business journalists, and we should view it on a level of what these tycoons and financiers would have done in the United States or in the United Kingdom or in the Netherlands. Well, actually, in the Netherlands it actually happened, but let's say the United States or United Kingdom. Yeah, they would have. They would have done the same, because I do think that the conditions inherent to capitalism also, perpetrate can cross the line and go into criminal acts, and that would have been the same in the United States. I think. Yeah, I do think that. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I think in about 5 minutes we'll take. I'll go to the Q&A, and I'll read through those, and you'll indulge me as I read through them. But I want to remind people just not to give just comments, however interesting they might be in the Q&A, but just to keep those to the questions. I think the chat will be where people can share their thoughts, make comments. If we could, let's just talk about maybe today and Germany. And I don't want to put you on the spot necessarily, but there's a war going on. There's a country, Ukraine, that's been attacked, and Germany has been criticized for the business stance. And you can say, hey, who are we to judge Germany? They depend on natural gas from Russia. What is your take on that kind of question?
Well, my take is that Germany has made itself beholden is addicted to Russian gas and oil, and that its politicians. I mean, Gerhard Schröder. I think many of us read the incredible, mind-blowing interview that Katrin Benhold did with Gerhard Schröder in the New York Times last week. he's literally he's Putin's lackey, and willingly so. I mean, he has no qualms about admitting so. So it goes to show. I mean, a former German chancellor for 7 years that is basically bought by the Russian regime is very telling for and this is the Social Democrat Party, right? Very telling for the stance for the broader the way Germany made itself completely reliant, didn't want itself wean itself off of Russian gas and oil, particularly gas. And which also explains the muted response. I mean, there's two factors to it. First of all, when it comes to any kind of war, Germany is very scared to do anything. I mean, Germany is very scared of its own power, of its own might, right? When we're talking about, they're terribly afraid of making the wrong decision and backfiring, and everybody pointing to Germany. We look at them, they messed up again. So it's that fear, right, that keeps them from making any kind of substantial policy decisions, bar the fact, of course, that Olaf Scholz announced, that the current chancellor announced that they're going to ramp up, which is a major step, the defense budget to 100 billion euros. And I mean, secondly, policy decisions have been made under Kohl, under Chancellor Helmut Kohl, then under Schröder, then under Merkel. Merkel was very, was Merkel and Putin were, Putin respected Merkel very much. That made Germany beholden to Russia, and now they have to deal with the consequences, and it's going to be extremely difficult for Germany to get out of it without hurting their economy and their bottom line very, very seriously. So they have to act very carefully, and of course, Germany being the dominant economy in Europe, but also on a global level, their actions have consequences, great consequences, politically and economically for the European continent, but also on a global scale. So I do understand their caution. I very much understand it, both from an historical perspective, a political perspective, and an economic perspective. But they must act. I mean, they have to withdraw from. They have to go through a painful withdrawal. It's going to be cold turkey, literally. It's
Yeah, as I read your book, I couldn't help thinking about some of the practical decisions made by some of these capitalists in the book, and practical decisions today by Germany.
Sure.
I want to shift gears just a little bit and go back to the book. There's one character that I think, I find kind of fascinating. I didn't know, it's my fault I didn't really know much about him. J McCloy.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about him and why he's an important or interesting character.
I mean, J McCloy was he was many things. He served many roles in American life. He was, he was an establishment. He was a Republican lawyer, a lawyer and banker, Republican, and he was the High Commissioner for Occupied Germany. He was appointed by Truman in 1950 as a High Commissioner for Occupied Germany, and made the political decision, or an expedient political decision, to commute the sentences for many industrialists, for the industrialists that were convicted under the Nuremberg trials, but particularly for many high-ranking SS officers who had slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Jews, as commanding the Einsatzgruppe in Eastern Europe.
Dozens and dozens and dozens.
Dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens. I mean, let's not make any mistake about it. Dozens and dozens and dozens. There were only those whose acts were, I mean, how can you even compare these things, right? We deemed so egregious that they ended up being executed. But dozens and dozens of high-ranking SS officers whose death sentences were commuted to life sentences, and whose sentences were then shortened to 3-4 years, and they were out by the mid-50s, or by, in some cases, 1957.
I was shocked by that. I was naive about that. I was shocked.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was a appeasement. It was a decision of they wanted to appease West Germany. The Korean War had broken out. The Cold War was raging. They needed they needed West Germany as an ally, as the key industrialized Western nation again from the early 1950s onwards. To fill, I mean, first Truman and then Eisenhower enacted the War Defense Act. American factories were producing for the war effort in Korea, and Germany was able to fill that gap. But the German public and Konrad Adenauer, the very influential chancellor, were not happy with their citizens still being held at Landsberg prison for war crimes. And you know, I've gone through the archives at Columbia, which holds Telford Taylor's archives, which was the prosecutor for the subsequent Nuremberg trials, and you know, he was outraged by John J McCloy's decision, like so angry, rightfully. And there's nothing, and I went to the John J McCloy archive at Amherst College, and you know, there's nothing, and it's so much of it there is still redacted actually in the McCloy archive there. But there is no explanation, anything I read about or from McCloy in terms of why he made this decision, other than political expediency. I mean, it was just, you know, it's mind blowing.
And McCloy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he's also responsible for the Japanese internment camps in the United States, coming up with that
Yes,
idea.
I mean, yeah. Sorry.
And yet McCloy could not be more of an establishment figure in the United States, advisor to almost every president,
Absolutely.
both sides of both parties. Yeah, he's a fascinating character. And just before we wind things down and take some questions, I just want to kind of get your sense for how much do they know? How much do they know about the atrocities that were going on? How much it was a willful ignorance? Weigh in on that if you could.
Yeah. They knew about what was going on in their factories' mines. They knew the exploitation of forced enslaved laborers, or the use of concentration camp inmates, Jewish men and women that were used in their factories and mines on a large scale. They did not know about the Holocaust. They didn't know about the extermination camps.
They did not know, because I think you had a scene where they took him on a tour or two, and it looked, they took him.
Yes, they took him on a tour to Dachau in 1936, and Dachau was the first concentration camp. It was never an extermination camp. I mean, the extermination camps were, you know, built in secret during the war, or well, secret to the SS and the Nazi regime and their you know, and the locale and the people living close by to it, right, in Poland. They knew, but yeah, I mean, Heinrich Himmler, the SS leader and the architect of the Holocaust, takes his you have this, you know, fundraise group for the SS, Himmler circle of friends, which Friedrich Flick and Richard Kasalowski, two of the main characters in my book, are members of, and Otto Steinbrink too. And they get this kind of Potemkin village tour of Dachau, but everybody knew, you know, already, this is 1936, right? Everybody knew that these were atrocious, horrific, awful places. But that's a concentration camp, right? And I mean, we have to distinguish. I mean, these are nuances, but I haven't found any evidence that the industrialists were aware of the systematic extermination of Jewish men, women, and children in extermination camps. But they knew what their own companies, the atrocities their own companies were committing, right, on a large scale, using, you know, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children too, in their factories and mines. Of course, these men had no qualms about acquiring Jewish-owned businesses, businesses owned by men and women in Nazi-occupied territories, or mass producing for the Nazi war machine. So they were very much aware of what they were doing. Absolutely, this didn't go. This was not. They were executives of their companies, and they knew, and they cared about their bottom lines. They cared about making profits. They knew what was going on in their companies at the time. Absolutely.
So I'm going to pick and choose, and I apologize for questions that I missed. There are a lot of them, and I have to read quickly. So I'm going to pick some that I can digest quickly and share. Sarah asks, are there American brands or business people and their heirs that also profited off the Nazi regime? They do, excuse me, did business with any of the families you write about?
There are three main examples that come to, well, there's two main examples that come to mind. General Motors owned Opel, which was a German car brand, and they had extensive dealings in Germany during the Third Reich. And Opel itself, mass-produced weapons, used forced and slave labor. So General Motors was, through its subsidiary, was very much involved, and also had ties. GM executives met with Hitler, and it's all well documented. And of course, there's a famous example of IBM, which delivered the computers that tabulated the Holocaust. There's no really other way of putting it. And also tabulated all the assets that were stolen and seized from Jewish men and women going into concentration camps or into extermination camps and never returned. That's another, and that's also something that IBM completely glosses over on their corporate. They don't show anything of that. And of course, there's the famous example of Henry Ford, who was massive admirer of Hitler, virulent anti-Semite, and but he obviously, Ford didn't produce for the German market so much at the time.
I'm going to paraphrase another question. Do you you talk about transparency and what some of these foundations and companies could do? What about in terms of reparations? Do you have a view on that?
I mean, there is in 1999, an agreement was made between first of all, there's many individual agreements that were made, through legal recourse after the war, where surviving heirs or business owners tried to get their companies back or their assets back from that had been expropriated or appropriated. So there were many individual settlements, and still a lot going on today when it comes to real estate and art, for example, right? So that is one part of the, so to say, the restitution question. Now, when it comes to the compensation question of forced and slave labor, there was the agreement between the American and German government that was made in 1999. Stuart Eisenstadt negotiated on behalf of the American government under the Clinton administration, with the Schroeder administration, and it saw for the establishment of a foundation called EVZ, Memory, Remembrance, and Future. I only know it's Erinnerung, Verantwortung und Zukunft. Yeah, so remembrance, responsibility, and future, in which about 10 billion Deutschmark, which was about 5.6 billion euros at the time, about 6 billion USD, was put into this foundation to compensate surviving forced slave laborers between 2001 and 2006. Half of the money was contributed by the German government. Half of the money was supposed to be paid in by German business. By the time the payouts were between 2001 and end of 2006. By the time the foundation was established, many German companies had not paid up yet. Ended up that 18 big German businesses were the main initiators, and also the main ones that were sued in class action lawsuits in the US by survivors. Ended up paying about 60% of the entire, 18 companies of the 6,500 companies were responsible for 60% of the bulk of the money that was paid into. And this is very important, in the agreement between the United States government and the German government, the German companies did not have to, they didn't have to admit to any wrongdoing or any kind of culpability.
Marcy Bloom asks about that BMW Study Center of German History at Georgetown. How does the university explain or justify this disgraceful moral contradiction?
I only recently learned of it, and I actually want to follow up with Georgetown and ask how they view that. Yeah, so I haven't. It was only something recent. I have not reached out to them yet to do follow up reporting and discuss it with them.
Yeah, you should write an article for a U.S. publication about that. That'd be a good follow up. Let's see. Well, I guess there were some people asking in terms of the genesis of the book a little bit more, and maybe what you found most surprising in your research.
I think most surprising two things. I think it's the brazen whitewashing that still happened today after companies like BMW and Porsche are pretending that they've reckoned with this past, even though they're leaving the history out. And secondly, I think the scale of the crime still astounded me, just kind of how widespread, how the scale of it, the numbers of people of forced and slave laborers they exploited in their companies, the number of Jewish owned businesses that were taken over far below market value, or assets that were robbed outright. I think it's still the scale of it all that still astounds me.
Okay, and let's see. We'll do one last question. Let's see. Yeah, I'll paraphrase Stevens. Will this book have an impact, do you think, in terms of the attitude of any of the companies, do you think? No.
No, I said, yeah. No, I said, yeah. No, that's not what I said. No, okay. I said, I said, yeah. I said, yeah. I said, well, listen, today is May 5th. It's the publication day of the German translation. Germany is like most very big countries. I myself come from quite a small country, but like most big countries, they're quite insular, and there's not a lot of spillover. There's not any spillover from English speaking media or English language media to the German press. And I'm very curious how the book is going to be received in Germany and whether that it's going to have any effect on, because any change has to come from within Germany. I mean, they're not going to yield to outside forces.
It's fascinating stuff. I could go on, and I apologize for those I couldn't get to everyone's question, but they were good questions. I just didn't have time. I'm going to pass it over to Sydney. I want to thank David personally, and David, it's still Yom Ha'atzmaut over there, so I think you should go out and celebrate. It's a wonderful day over there. So thank you for taking the time, and I'll pass it over to Sydney.
Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, I want to echo what Gregory said, and thank you so much, David, and thank you so much to Gregory. This was such a really interesting interview, and I personally learned so much. So thank you both for taking the time to be here today. And I also want to thank all of you out there in the internet verse for joining us today. I highly encourage you to go purchase Nazi Billionaires, which you can do at the link in the Zoom chat. Also, everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. So to those of you watching, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can check out also at the links in the Zoom chat. Have a great afternoon. Thank you again to Gregory and David. This was amazing. And thank you all again for joining us.
Thank you, Sydney.
Bye.
Thanks a lot, Greg.